Hi everyone, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles, the series of books and videos on American history as seen through the lives of the presidents of the United States. This episode is from the life of John Adams, and the focus is family. And family was critically important to Adams his entire life, and for the first quarter century or so of that life, it was his father, Deacon John Adams, a member of the church, a highly respected member of the community, of course a local farmer as well, and the man who really gave John Adams his start in the world from a work ethic standpoint, education, sense of moral purpose, virtuous nature, selfless dedication to the community, all of those characteristics of person that John Adams eventually embraced, many of which came directly from his father, and in fact, they were a perfect fit. Now, his father was a demanding, difficult man at times, but Adams really warmed to this kind of work ethic, and so it became a very important part of Adams's upbringing. Well, that lasted until his father passed in 1761, and another person came into Adams' life who was the central figure for the rest of his life. Her name was Abigail Smith, and they married in 1764. Completely compatible in so many ways, including, really important for John Adams, was intellectually compatible. At one point, Adams said to his wife, "I want to hear you think or to see your thoughts." This was the level of intimacy that John Adams was looking for in his wife Abigail, and in very many ways, they both achieved. They were compatible in many ways, and she was perfect for him in that she ran the household, she raised the children, she oversaw the farm while he was away. She did a lot of work, and again, he was away a lot as a lawyer at the Continental Congress, and then for years on end as a diplomat in service on behalf of his country. Now, it didn't mean that she was meek in any way, because she also spoke her mind when she felt necessary to her husband. One of those cases when he was not writing very many letters from his time over in Europe as a diplomat. And she wrote, "Cautious as 'tis necessary you should be, methinks you need not be so parsimonious in your letters." And he got the message and started writing a little bit more. In fact, the good thing for John and Abigail Adams is whenever they had these separations, and they might have started growing apart a little bit, as soon as they came back together physically, they came back together emotionally, spiritually, and everything was good again. Maybe the best example was in Europe, where finally after the Revolutionary War, the Treaty of Paris is concluded, and Adams finds it safe enough now for his family to travel. He asks Abigail and their oldest child, Nabby, to come and stay with him in Europe for the extended duties as a diplomat. And it ends up being probably the most enjoyable time of his life. He doesn't have that many responsibilities. It's family time. He's enjoying the scenery, the sights, the intellectual stimulation, both in France and eventually in his assignment in Britain. It's a really great time for the Adams family and for John Adams personally. Again, it was not easy to be the child, though, of John Adams. Just like it wasn't easy for him to be the child of his father, it was maybe even tougher for his children to follow in that same work ethic that he tried to put on his children that his father had imposed upon him. Now, to put this in perspective, in the 1770s, John Adams said, "Men must be ready and be happy to sacrifice their private pleasure, passions, and interests, nay, their private friendships and dearest connections when they stand in competition with the rights of society." This was difficult to do. It was difficult for Adams to do, and it was very difficult for several of his children to do, to put their own personal goals and interests aside for the selfless betterment of society. Now, for John Adams, this was in many ways his motivation for many of his greatest moments, but also some of his greatest angst, because he lost out on a lot of the approbation that he might have been looking for because of this sort of decision-making process that had been instilled in him by his father. And so he did the same. He tried to instill it in his children with very different results. In one case, he hit a home run, and that's with his son, John Quincy Adams, his oldest son, who was very much a chip off the old block. Now, we're going to have plenty of episodes on John Quincy later in Presidential Chronicles, but the quick rundown is John Quincy comes to Europe with his father as a young teenager, and he actually gets employed in the federal service as the secretary to the new minister to Russia for the United States. And so he's doing public service at the age of 14. He continues in that public service after coming back. He goes to Harvard, then he goes back to Europe for the George Washington administration. And Washington is so so impressed with John Quincy Adams as a Foreign Service officer that he gives John Adams the strong recommendation to keep his son employed in the Foreign Service, put nepotism aside. In this case, this kid is this good, you got to keep him employed. And so John Adams did. And John Quincy served him as the minister to Prussia, and even more importantly, gave him a lot of back-channel insight as to what was going on in and around France, which was the source of the greatest concerns of the Adams administration. So very helpful to his father during his term. But John Quincy was just getting started. He came back to the Foreign Service for President James Madison. For President James Monroe, he served 8 years as Secretary of State, and in 1824, John Quincy becomes President of the United States. Very proud moment for his father, who lives to see it just barely. He dies less than 2 years later. In fact, he misses some of John Quincy's greatest days were in his post-presidential years when he came back to Washington as a member of the House of Representatives, and he really put a line in the sand and argued vehemently against the extension of slavery that was being advanced by members of the House from the South. John Adams didn't live long enough to see John Quincy perform those functions that he would have been very proud of. The two actually were different politically, philosophy, but personality-wise, think of these terms. Ornery, argumentative, rarely content, that's both of them. Highly impactful, successful, committed to public service, that's both of them as well. Very much similarities between father and son. Now, Nabby, the oldest child of John and Abigail Adams, their only daughter, different expectations from her father for her. She was not expected to have a career. Really, the most important decision was whom she was going to marry. And so her father had advice for her, and he said, "Daughter, get you an honest man for a husband and keep him honest, no matter whether he is rich, provided he be independent. Regard the honor and moral character of the man more than all other circumstances. Think of no other greatness but that of the soul, no other riches but those of the heart." Now, these are things that John Adams had embraced in his relationship with Abigail and worked out really well. For Nabby, she settles on Colonel William Smith, who she actually meets when she's over in Europe with her family in England. Smith had served in the American Revolutionary War for the Continental Army, and originally John Adams was pretty pleased with the match. Later on, not so much, as he felt that Colonel Smith really started to neglect his daughter. And unfortunately, Nabby has a very difficult ending of her life. She gets breast cancer, she has a mastectomy. This is after Adams' term as president, and has a very painful death. Now, he's with her through much of these final years, but a very difficult time as she died in 1813. Now, as to the other boys, they really struggled with the John Adams work ethic. For Thomas, he was interested in a career in public service, and he asked his father about it. And John Adams replied to his son, "Integrity should be preserved in all events, as essential to his happiness to every stage of his existence. His first maxim, then, should be to place his honor out of reach of all men. In order to do this, he must make it a rule never to become dependent on public employment for subsistence. My advice to my children is to maintain an independent character." Well, this was the path that John Adams had followed. He had been a lawyer, and a successful one, earlier in his career, and he made enough money that he was actually able to support his public service over the years. But that's a tall order, to be able to go and have a successful career and then also serve the community. And frankly, the boys, Thomas and Charles, really struggled with this. In fact, at one point, John Adams made the acknowledgement that my children give me more pain than my enemies. And he was particularly worried about Charles at the time. This was during his presidency. Charles was the jokester in the family, but he just could never live up to his father's expectations. He becomes an alcoholic and causes all kinds of grief for the family, to the point where in the latter stages of Adams' presidency, he renounces his son. He says he's not going to have anything else to do with him, and his son Charles, 1 month later, is dead from the alcohol. At the time, John Adams says, "The greatest grief of my heart and the deepest affliction of my life." Charles Adams, he just had no answer. He couldn't change himself or his expectations. And Charles, and in many cases Thomas as well, they just couldn't live up to these really lofty expectations like John Quincy was able to do. Now, John Adams lives out his retirement years, almost 25 years, one of the longest post-presidential retirements in American history. That's back at their farm, Peace Field in Braintree, Massachusetts. He's actually got a lot of family around him, in part because his children had such difficulty, whether physically, medically, or economically, that a lot of the grandchildren actually came to stay with the Adamses. And even though he becomes increasingly infirm, he enjoys being around the grandchildren and spends plenty of time with them. John Adams lasts until 1826. Abigail wouldn't make it that far. She passes in 1818. And John Adams writes to Thomas Jefferson after they had been estranged for a while. They're now writing letters again to each other. And he writes Jefferson, "The dear partner of my life for 54 years as a wife and for many more years more as a lover, now lies in extremis, forbidden to speak or be spoken to." And a few days later, she passed, again in October of 1818, just shy of her 74th birthday. Clearly, that was a major ending in the life of John Adams, but he still had 8 more years to go. A lot of that was spent at Peace Field in Braintree with his grandchildren and other members of his family. John Adams was not an easy man to be around at times, or certainly to be a member of his family. Some, like John Quincy, totally bought into the package, lived up to expectations, in fact becomes President of the United States. For others, it was a very difficult life. Thomas and Charles really struggled, both turning to alcoholism and Charles dying from it at a relatively early age. The one area where, of course, John Adams never really had any long-term problems was with his spouse. The greatest content in his life came from Abigail, his true companion for more than 50 years. And that is a sketch of the family of John Adams from the life of John Adams. For more Presidential Chronicles, check out my books on Amazon.com, and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Until next time, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles.